For this session. As you know, because you're here, Moonshot House is an exclusive invite-only community where at the same time we're committed to a level of openness and connection and building real human relationships in a way that you may not have experienced in other venues. We're in the early stages of building out this global virtual community, a think tank, if you will, focused on innovation, entrepreneurship, designing the future, and all the things that we care deeply about. Our community is primarily two types of folks. We call them champions and founders, and those are broader categories that include everyone from top-level industry leaders and investors all the way through to the founders, the engineers, the people who are really building the stuff that will create the life we live in the not-so-distant future. As part of our regular programming, we have an event called Fireside Chat, and that's what you're at today. And Tracy is going to lead us through a conversation with one of the most interesting people I've had a chance to get to know in this world, Chris Fenton. I'll let her introduce him. But let me start by saying a few things about Tracy so you know who's leading our session today. Tracy is a seasoned media expert. She's conducted over 2,600 interviews across a variety of platforms from print, digital, TV, online, and podcasting, which is her particular passion and love. She and her husband and business partner, Tom Hazzard, have a brand called Podetize, which is poised to shake up the podcasting and advertising industry in some very unique and powerful ways. And of course, we'll hear about that from Tracy in other contexts. But Tracy is probably the best person I can think of to lead this conversation with our featured guest, Chris Fenton. Tracy, I'll be here, but I'm going to duck off screen and I'll be around the edges of this. Again, to everyone, thank you so much for being here. Take it away, Tracy.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Appreciate it. And I'm excited to have so many interesting interviews to get to do here at Moonshot House. And this one is of particular interest to me as I have family in and around the Hollywood industry, but I personally also spent a lot of time in China. So we're going to have some discussions about this idea of commerce and culture together. But before we get to that, I want to really get you all to understand and know some more about Chris Fenton. Chris recently completed a 17-year tenure as the president of DMG Entertainment Motion Picture Group and the general manager of DMG North. He's orchestrated an internationally creative and business activities of DMG, which is a multi-billion-dollar global media company headquartered in Beijing. It's publicly traded on the Shenzhen Exchange, which means that it has a little bit of a different government pull than other entities. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Specifically, Fenton supervised the development, financing, production, marketing, and distribution of the globally focused entertainment content. In addition, he managed DMG's vast library of intellectual property, which in the case of intellectual property in film is the movies themselves or the TV shows or the underlying IP, which might be the characters. So all of that is within that realm, as well as he directed the mergers and acquisitions and strategic usage of DMG's capital resources. It grew from a 35-employee private company worth $100 million to an 800-employee company and multi-billion during his incumbency. He also produced or supervised 20 films ranging from big budget franchises you've heard of, like Iron Man 3, Point Break, 47 Ronin, Looper, Waiting, Blockers, and Chappaquiddick. They've done more than $2 billion in the box office. Chris has lots of speaking engagements. I can't even list them all, but I mean, he just gave me an updated list. Interestingly, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, he's been on going in contrast from NPR to ultra-right media, getting interviewed by people like Steve Bannon, Anthony Scaramucci. So it's been a really interesting time for him right now, and we're definitely going to get to that. So, but first I want to start with a little bit of the foundational things, which is that you have an engineering degree from Cornell University. How does an engineer get to Hollywood?
Well, thanks for the introduction, and thank you so much for having me on today. I'm humbled and honored to do it. This was one of the speaking engagements I've been looking forward to this week. How did I get into it? Well, quite frankly, it had to do with not really having a lot of opportunities coming out of Cornell. I graduated in 1993, which was in a bit of a recessionary period at the time. I unfortunately wasn't the most aggressively successful engineering student. I think I had like a 2.7 GPA, even had to go one summer to finish up on time. So when I got out, I didn't have a lot of job offers. So I essentially got in a car, drove cross country trying to find a city or a town where I wanted to live the rest of my life. And I stayed in fraternity houses. I was in a particular house at Cornell, and I would just crash on couches. And eventually it got me out to Los Angeles, where I was just coming through to visit. I had a buddy who was a hotel and restaurant management friend of mine from Cornell. He was an assistant beverage director at the Pretty Woman Hotel at the foot of Rodeo Drive. It was at the time called the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. I was crashing on his floor, and I just sort of was like, God, this is a place where it's 72 and sunny every day, and everybody's beautiful, and it seems like there's so much great stuff here. And at the time, it was crazy because Los Angeles, no one wanted to live in. It was an economically depressed city. Just before I arrived, we had the fires of both Laguna Beach and Malibu, which burnt down like half of Malibu. They also had floods that year. And then I moved here just in time for the Northridge earthquake.
I was going to say, you were just in time for the earthquake, which is about, usually that's our way of weeding out those that don't belong here, is we give them an earthquake and then they leave.
I came very close to being weeded out after that. And my mom and dad, who had lived in San Francisco, they're like, oh, earthquakes happen all the time. And I was like, I think this one was a little bigger than one of those little ones that you experienced. But yeah, that came close. But I was flat broke, got a job, and I talk about it in the book, just how I got into the business, how I sort of rose through the business, all the trials and errors and the failures and some successes, and then how I fell into China.
Well, for those who don't know the industry, and I do because my brother-in-law is part of it as well. And so, and I have lived so close and have many friends in it. But for those that don't, what are some of those characteristics that it really takes to make it? Because, I mean, everything is a block in your way along the way. Everything's an obstacle.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is when you come out, you realize the few people that that are in the business all grew up in the business somehow, or they had nieces and nephews or fathers or mothers that were in it. So that's how they broke in. What's interesting about a lot of those players is that the drive, the motivation, the determination wasn't quite there because they sort of had that lockstep into the business, and it just sort of felt more entitled than anything. So when I finally got a temp job at the William Morris agency, I had to figure out how to get promoted from a mailroom or from a music fax room clerk in the music department. I was faxing out contracts to the Eagles, Nirvana, etc. How to get from there promoted into what they call the mailroom, which was
that's a step up, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the start of your journey in the business. And I had to figure out how to meet the right people to get in there. And when I actually got in that mailroom, there were a lot of people in there that were legacies of somebody in the business. They had amazing degrees and whatever, but they didn't have the chutzpah or the determination or the drive to stick through it, because it was grueling. I was making $300 a week delivering mail in the mailroom of William Morris, and I was teaching SAT courses on weekends to make enough money to survive. And it was a really, I look back at it really fondly. It was the most exciting, vibrant, most adventurous time, I guess, until China came along. But it was interesting. You really needed to want to grind and meet everybody you could and network so that you could build the foundation of what would later become your lifeblood in the business, which is the people and even people you hadn't spoken to in 20 years. And I talk about it in the book through my use of a Rolodex system that really was my saving grace in a lot of situations.
So it sounds like you have the characteristics of really being able to build relationships. What do you do in that process to start to build them into something stronger where it's not just an acquaintance that you met at a Hollywood party?
Yeah, well, number one is I found out quickly that relationships were really built best by people in the trenches with you. So the first thing you do when you come out, or at least I did, was I thought you wanted to meet the most powerful people you could possibly get to know, and then use, that network to try to figure out, okay, well, what can I provide them in order to maybe get them to help me with something. What you soon found out is those people already had their network and they already knew what they needed to do to get to that next level. And yeah, a lot of them were okay with taking a phone call or sitting down with you, but really going to bat for you wasn't there. So what you found were the people that went to bat for you were the same ones in the same position as you. They were low level interns, assistants, maybe coordinators, and that might have been the most highest level person I knew. But they were the people that were battling in the trenches with you. They were locked arm with you in that freshman class of Hollywood. And that was the class of Hollywood that I became closest to, and I'm still closest to. Even as recently as the other day, I reached out to somebody I hadn't spoken to in 20 years, but we spent 5 years grinding away on different projects at William Morris. And it was like we had just spoken yesterday.
You
It's
had
a
shared
crazy sort of
pain
phenomenon.
there.
Yeah, and then one thing I talk about in the book, which really helped me, is my father taught me this idea of when you meet somebody, on the back of their Rolodex card, write down every little tidbit of information you remember from that meeting or that lunch, so that when you call them 10 years later, you can ask them about their daughter and you know their age or their favorite sport, or are they still addicted to Mulberry's pizza or whatever it is. And that really reconnects that glue that was there 10 years prior, even if you hadn't spoken to them in 10 years.
Did you find that there was anything about that sort of engineering mind that you had that served you well? Because that's pretty different than most of the people that you'll come across in Hollywood.
Well, I talk in the book, I describe my early days at the Olive Garden and some engineering discipline I used to become employee of the month a couple months there. That was more just humor than anything. But through time and through the progress of my career, engineering to me is a practical and applied sort of way of thinking, and it's really problem solving. And there were a lot of situations where, yes, I didn't use calculus or thermodynamics or anything I learned in a Carl Sagan class, but that idea of, okay, you have a problem that seems hard to fix, like how do you get to the solution? And one of the amazing things about engineering, and I'm sure there's a lot of disciplines like this, but to get from point A to point Z, there's all those different like parts of the equation you got to write down to get to that solution. And when it came to China, the worst part about China for a lot of people is they get there or they see the potential of that market and they think so big and so far into the future about where they can take a product or service that they're selling there, that they don't think about, well, what's the next step in that equation that gets to the next one, that gets to the next one, that allows you to get to the solution to the problem. And for me, that was literally about figuring out baby steps and how you check the box every time you go down and you get closer and closer and closer to the ultimate goal. And in the book, I use this idea of case studies where, unfortunately, at the time, no one had ever done anything that we were trying to do. So there was no easy cruise control or, oh, let's just do what they did and
Everything's a new problem, right?
Everything was a new problem. Everything was historic in a way. All the failures we had were historic and all the successes we had were historic, but it was everything we did was built upon something we had finished in the past, because everything I had to try to achieve with US partners was saying, hey, we can do this for you. Like that Iron Man poster back there. Hey, we can do Iron Man with you, Marvel and Disney, because we did a $35 million movie called Looper that was a success. And the Looper success was, hey, we can do Looper with you because we figured out how to get the Twilight movies into China. And how did we get the Twilight movies? Well, we figured out how to get what we call it, Guanxi, with the Ministry of Propaganda and SARFT through our advertising agency. So we knew we had the abilities to get movies in just simply because we had the relationships and the case study battle tested, sort of wherewithal with successes that we've had with those organizations to be able to push something we hadn't done before.
So we're building success on success as an example and moving that forward. I really think that's a great piece of advice in how to operate in various industries, not just in Hollywood. Well, let's talk a little bit about the height of your career while you were still in LA before the whole shift happened over to China. What was the biggest success that you had in those earlier years?
Well, when I was at William Morris, first of all, I got promoted really early. There was a saying when I got into the business that people said, the hardest part in Hollywood is going from being an assistant to having an assistant. That jump, so many people were never able to make. And I had a mentor, Jerry Katzman, who was the vice chairman at William Morris at the time. And he had a liking to me because I walked into his office one day and I said I wanted to be his morning assistant, which meant you had to get in at 6 a.m. and answer phone calls until his regular assistant came in. And he looked at me and he said, "What are you wearing?" And I said, "Oh, you like my suit?" And he said, "Where was that made?" And I said, "Oh," and I opened it up. I was like, "Yugoslavia." He goes, "Where'd you buy that?" I said, "Oh, there's a store on Hollywood and Vine." He's like, "What did that cost?" He's like, I said to him, I'm not sure what it cost. Well, I got 3 of them for $99. So I guess $33. He's like, "You're hired." So I think what he saw in me was this kid who had I grew up in a middle-class household with all that I needed and some of what I wanted. So I wasn't a rags to riches story, but for Hollywood, I was sort of that project, right? So he took a liking to me. And then one day, as I was slaving away in the motion picture department, he said, "I want you to go interview for the TV and syndication and cable job that's available right now as an assistant." I said, "What's syndication?" He's like, "Well, Baywatch and things like that. Go up there and tell them that's all you ever wanted to do." So I went up there and I got that job. And the reason he told me that is he said, that's the quickest path to being promoted. And once you're promoted, you can do anything you want. So I took his advice, got promoted at 24 and rose up through the ranks. And what was interesting is I was able to get back into the feature business because I started representing clients in television that were writing scripts that we sold in the feature world. So one was Michael McCullers, who I had signed, who was writing on the MTV Movie Awards. He created this relationship with a young comedian named Mike Myers. And then they went and wrote a script called Austin Powers, which we went out and sold. He obviously took off to a whole nother level in the feature business because of that. And then there was another guy who was actually a manager friend of mine who went to Cornell also and represented me on a book I had written in college. And he represented these young guys that wrote a script called Rounders. And it was about the inner workings of the poker world, which I read the script. I said, "This is a fantastic script, but I don't know anything about this world. And I don't think anybody else does," because this was way before poker was anything. But ultimately, they took me to some poker parlors and we saw what was going on. I was like, this is an amazing world. And we sold the script and it became a hit movie. And quite frankly, it might have started the whole poker craze in a bit. It was Brian Koppelman and David Levine, amazing writers. They write for Billions now. That's their show. But anyway, those were some of those fantastic case studies.
Those high moments. So, but you're always taking risks. I mean, that Hollywood's about a lot of risks, right? You think you're building off of something, you think it's going to succeed, but you really don't know. The same as many of our listeners and watchers here who are doing their own ventures, right? They're very risky as well. How do you make some decisions about what to take a risk on?
Well, I'd like to say I'm a huge risk taker. I think I'm a risk taker mainly because it just happens. When I graduated, you could say, "Oh, you took a risk and came out to Los Angeles and got in the Hollywood business." Well, it wasn't really a risk because I didn't really risk anything. I didn't have a job coming out of college. So I was a wandering soul trying to find something.
There was nothing to lose.
Yeah. And then taking a risk and diving into figuring out how to get in the mailroom and all that kind of stuff. Well, it wasn't really a risk because my career at the moment was, being a waiter at the Olive Garden. So, and then as things progressed, I talk about some of the failures I had. One of them was actually getting fired from William Morris.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. So you took a big risk that got you fired at the end of the day. What set that up a little bit for us?
Yeah, it wasn't necessarily a risk. It was playing a game that I thought was the way I wanted to do it, which was a very sort of team oriented, not trying to take credit for things like bringing in people into certain clients and so on. That ultimately I found out that, and early in the book, I come across a woman who tells me that I'm too nice to be an agent. And I got told that so many times. And I'm not trying to flatter myself in front of everybody. I'm essentially saying one of the things I didn't have was the shark mentality that you really needed to be in that alpha male driven business. And ultimately it bit me in the ass. I was too team oriented. I didn't have a collection of clients that I could walk out the building with. I had too many people involved with them. And ultimately I had a falling out with a boss who took advantage of that. And I was left on the streets. And it just so happened, once again, you want to call it a risk, but I'll say that China was sort of my Rod Tidwell. I had a bag with a goldfish in it, and I had a client that was sort of germinating in the China market that had nobody else to talk to in the United States, and they became one of my main clients, and that sort of built into what the story progresses into.
Well, so that's an interesting thing is like, this is in front of you and you say, I'm just going to take it because I've got nothing else. Like, again, nothing to lose here. Maybe something will come of it. And so you don't, sometimes that's just to keep moving, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do find, and I'm sure I can be proven wrong a million times, but a lot of entrepreneurs that I've come across in my life aren't, and I think this scares people from being an entrepreneur or taking risks, because they think, oh, all these people that did it, they have some sort of really gutty instinct and it just makes them want to try something that no one else wants to do. It's too scary or whatever. But a lot of entrepreneurs literally became entrepreneurs or risk takers because the safe path didn't exist for them. So they just had to go do it. Maybe they, failed out of college, or they got fired, or they couldn't find that first job, and they just said, screw it, I'm going to go create my own job. So I do think that there's this barrier to entry to becoming an entrepreneur, because there's a myth that you have to be this insane risk taker. I actually think life a lot of times sort of lays that path out for you.
It forces your hand.
Yeah, it forces your hand, or you sit there and go, well, I'm going to keep pounding away to try to get the safe path. And sometimes getting the safe path is harder than going the entrepreneurial path.
You know what? I think you're right. Now, I think you'll be proven right there. I can attest to that as well. I wouldn't be in this position of being an entrepreneur of the company that I am today if it hadn't been for the fact that my husband lost his job, right? And then we did everything we could, called all our friends, and ended up saying, well, we can take this project, but we got to have a business. And that's how we started our business. So same thing. Well,
I think you're going to, by the way, I think you're going to see COVID promote that type of entrepreneurship all over again.
I agree with
really
you. Yeah, very interesting. Well, let's start to set up what happened over in China and some of the lessons that you learned over there. But what I really want to do is get a little bit of your perspective, because there's differing perspectives of what the role of Hollywood in the world is. Is it a commerce role? Is it a culture role? What has your viewpoint been from your positioning within it? Because you're in that sort of producer and execution, and you're on that side of it.
Yeah, once again, I wasn't an academic or an expert on sort of the stuff that I learned over just applied and practical experience. But one of the things I saw that was extremely powerful about, first of all, we're all in the business. Well, we call it business because it's commerce. We're to make a living, to have a career, you need to generate income. So that was always the number one priority for anybody that I came across, because that's how you put a roof over your head and pay for food and all the other stuff. So commerce is there. And the beauty of the commerce that I was in is that it was cultural. We started, and in the book, I talk about some of the stuff we did with the NBA and Nike and Michael Phelps and the Olympics, et cetera, which was sports culture. But then I also talk quite a bit about my roots in Hollywood and the culture of the entertainment business. And what's amazing about the business of culture is that it's not just transactional, it's collaborative, it's creative, it puts emotional and humanistic connections together in order to create the product that you're making in the cultural space. So one of the, I call it positive shrapnel of the sort of the bomb that goes off when you're creating successful commerce and cultural exchanges is this camaraderie that occurs with the people that are doing it, right? And one of the things, and we're right now we're in the middle of packaging my book into making it into sort of into a television series, something that's inspired by. But the idea of the series is really trying to take what's happening in the macro world, these two superpowers colliding overhead, almost like you can imagine like the clouds colliding, and you got Zeus and Poseidon fighting each other, and you got what's going on every day today between the WeChat and the TikTok stuff and what we just did sanctioning all the people in Hong Kong and the different things that are happening between Beijing and Washington DC. All of that we had no control over, right? And we had no control over how it was covered by either the right or the left, which you want to talk about too. And the messaging that's going to the populace and the way people looked at what we were doing. I mean, I was called Benedict Arnold in the Los Angeles Times, and I cite that in the book. And quite frankly, on some of these shows that I do, I try to go on and see the commenters, and I get a fair amount of, you should have gone to jail for treason, like that kind of stuff. So all of that is happening around you. And all we're trying to do is make a movie, or all we're trying to do is
right. Isn't that the thing? Right? Is that like, you're just like, we just want to make a movie. Why did it have to be so complicated? And you don't expect that.
It's so true. And there's so much scrutiny from critics and journalists and regulators. I talk about the SEC that was investigating a lot of stuff that we were involved with all the Hollywood studios. It's a really, really crazy amount of antagonists that are trying to keep, if we call us the protagonists, from getting these jobs done. And we know the stakes because it's all out there. But when you're actually trying to collaborate and make a movie, that's all you're focused on. Just get the movie done, and we're trying to implement some China relevancy so we can open the market and monetize it better. And a lot of that stuff now I look back at and I go, wow, we were complicit in a lot of this pandering and kowtowing and that PEN America report that came out the other day. It's amazing what hindsight 2020 is. And that's one of the things I discuss in the book. But the book itself is like a Michael Lewis memoir trying to explain and describe in an engaging and entertaining way what the chaos was of just trying to get the job done that we were doing. And then it also, towards the end, looks back at it and says, okay, that's how we got here in this relationship with China. We did a lot of stuff that we probably shouldn't have done. How are we going to move forward?
Well, and we talked about this one in our pre-call, you and I, that you believe that your role is to be a bridge builder, that it's not about compromise. It's about trying to build this bridge between the two places that to get everybody across it, right? Because you want to get to the end result. What are some of the things that you tap into when you're trying to negotiate, when you're trying to see that bigger picture around you, because that's your role at the top?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. There's a very influential blogger website called Bleeding Cool. It's run by Rich Johnston, and he's very difficult on almost everything. And he read my book in 6 hours or whatever and absolutely loved it. And he's out there leaking excerpts about exactly what you're talking about. And in fact, he's doing such a good job of describing the excerpts and what exactly we were doing at the time that it's actually cringeworthy for me, because I'm reading through somebody else's eyes and commentary what I was trying to get, for instance, Marvel to do with particular characters in Iron Man 3 or what we were trying to do with Bruce Willis's wife in Looper, or how we were trying to portray Twilight as Romeo and Juliet or Titanic rather than some sort of movie that involves vampires. Even this sort of terrible remake that I'm still ashamed I made, but it was sort of near and dear to my heart, Point Break. You know, there were issues, even us, we were trying to figure out the nuance of getting the government support in China. And there's a scene in that Point Break, and I don't know if anybody on here has seen it, and if you have and you're upset about it, I apologize. But the opening of the movie was going to take place in Shanghai, on the top floor of one of those glistening 150-story buildings. And of course, on the top floor of one of those glistening, high buildings is a diamond dealer. And our Robin Hood characters in the movie come up a freight elevator on motorcycles. They drive through the diamond dealer, crashing, hammers through the different shelves, grabbing all the diamonds, and they keep driving faster and faster to the other side of the building. And everybody's like, where are they going? Chase after them. And lo and behold, they drive right out the window of the 150th floor. And you're like, what the heck? But they have, of course, parachutes on, and they parachute across the river in Shanghai towards the Bund Harbor front. And during the process, because they're Robin Hood characters, they release all the diamonds to the people below. And then all these, peasants and poor people grab the diamonds, and it's a fantastic sort of Robin Hood, take from the rich, give to the poor moment. But China, and we got everybody excited about this scene, but then China says, you can't do that in Shanghai. And we said, well, why? And they're like, well, that wouldn't happen in China. And we said, I don't understand. And they go, well, first of all, they would have been caught before they stole the diamonds. And number two is, even if they didn't get caught and started spraying the diamonds around the city, no one would pick up the diamonds because those diamonds aren't theirs. So it's completely unrealistic for the China market. So
and you're like a cultural misunderstanding here of how things work, right?
And we loved it. We loved the scene. So we ended up shooting it in Germany. But anyway, it's interesting because you're just like, you have to think about, like, Hunger Games, for instance, was another one where we always thought it would have a play in China, but most people were like, how would Hunger Games work? That's about a revolution. It's like Tiananmen Square and blah, 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 blah. But actually, when you look at the core of Hunger Games, it's about this massive difference between the wealthy and the leaders of the dystopian future and then everybody else. And essentially, the way China looked at Hunger Games was, it was the story of what Mao did to create communism from this have and have not culture prior. So it actually worked. The nuance is super, super interesting. And it seems basic when you think, why didn't I think about that? But when you're in the process of it, sometimes bad ideas come out of it.
So how long did you spend in China going, did you stay over there the whole time, immerse yourself?
So we had, and by the way, all this stuff that I talk about, I mean, it took a village to do. I wasn't the lone bridge builder. There were hundreds of us building these bridges, but I happened to be the one that needed to really keep the glue between China and the US. And China can be a bull in a China shop. And the demands and the mandates that they set forward are extremely, they're big turnoffs for a lot of North American and European companies. So it was my job to try to figure out, okay, I know what China wants in this. How do I explain it to our partners on it here in the West so that it's digestible and actually doable? And it's interesting today that Bleeding Cool website put an excerpt out about, and I look back at it and I go, what the hell was I doing? But it was a moment in a Marvel creative meeting after we had gotten to read a lot of the script for Iron Man 3, where I was pitching this idea of how to implement China into the storyline of the movie. And it actually involved, and this was before Xi Jinping was president or was running the country, but we knew he was probably the guy that was. And he had spent all this time in Iowa, actually living in the bunk beds of a family's kid's bedroom, because that's what the CCP members do at some point during their careers, they actually assimilate into the United States and they live here as common Americans and they learn what America's about. So I pitched this idea of the kid, and if you saw Iron Man 3, there's a kid that sort of helps Iron Man save the day. He releases this glove that's stuck in the shed and it flies onto Iron Man's fist, and then Iron Man comes and, you know, defeats all the bad people. Well, I pitched this idea of what if it was like a Xi Jinping who lived in the middle of America when Tony Stark needed to be saved. I mean, he almost died in the middle of the movie. And the kid of Xi Jinping, rather than some American kid, which it turned out to be, would be the one that would save Tony Stark and ultimately nurse him back to health. So you bring China really strongly into the movie. Now, I can't believe I pitched that in front of 18 Marvel executives and really believed it, because I was like, if we do this, we're going to make gazillions of dollars because Xi Jinping went, blah, blah. Fortunately, Marvel is like, that's a little too heavy-handed for us. So anyway, it's a funny way I described the whole meeting, but you know, looking back, it's hindsight being 2020. It's sort of amazing how we got here, and I just walked through a lot of those different scenarios where you know, what a lot of this sort of critique about how Hollywood, how the NBA, how Starbucks, how Apple, how Nike approaches that market has gone over the years, and what we need to do as America to feel good about it moving forward, because we obviously need to change the rules of engagement.
You know, this is one of the things that I found is that people, if you haven't spent enough time on the ground there, like if you want to get something done and you want to get it done well, then you need to get over there. Right? That you need to get in there, you need to find out how things work. I go to the factory floors, for instance, you know, when I was making products, and we would get down there and I'd work with the workers to get it. And that's the easiest way, is to sort of understand what's driving them. You can't understand that from that macro distance only. You can't sit back in your, you know, in your tower and go, yeah, this is how it works over there.
And I just, and I went on that tangent there to explain, and I didn't answer your original question, which was, did I ever live over there? And the answer to that is no. I spent a lot of time on the plane going back and forth, I don't know, 40 times or something during the years I was there. But, and it spent quite a bit of time when I was there. But really my job was most successful when I was here in person, talking to people and trying to get them to understand what we needed to do in order to get the product or service successfully monetized in that market. And to be over there, I just would be one of the China side. Right here, I was sort of that middle person that could work both sides and try to find a Venn diagram, sort of overlap.
Find that perspective that will work. Yeah. Yeah. So I want to remind everyone, you can type into the questions. We're going to get to them in about, 10 minutes or so. But I want to touch on, Chris, the idea of what's going on in the culture and commerce before we get into sort of the political side of it, because that it's gonna go that way no matter what. But there is this perception that we don't need China, that they don't need us. And I found the opposite. And it's interesting. It's a little of this viewpoint, and I've explained it this way, is that like they have their hand around our throat and we have our hand around theirs. They need our capital, of capitalism and consumerism of what we have going on here in the US to, drive their factories and to do the volume. And at the same time, we need their low cost and we need these other things. And so we have them that way. How have you found it to be in this case? Do they really need Hollywood? Do they really need what you're doing?
Well, do they really need, do they need microcosms of America? I would argue no in a lot of cases, mainly because if it's just on a micro level, the CCP and the Ministry of Propaganda can deflect attention away from something like this idea that they can't do without the NBA. NBA has so much leverage there. They love the NBA. Well, yes, they do, but China has only one source of information for most people there. There's obviously people with VPN and ways around the firewall, but for 1.4 billion people, the majority of that, they get one news story. It's like, imagine if Fox and CNN and MSNBC all had the same line. So if the NBA is something that the Ministry of Propaganda wants to wean the populace off, they're going to go divert their attention onto something else, or they'll promote the heck out of the CBA, the China Basketball Association, which has gained a lot of steam, just like the local film industry has against the Hollywood community. So to answer your question, on a micro level, they can definitely turn the switch off. And on a micro level, we could probably do the same thing. We don't need China on certain micro level areas. But in the macro area, and I wrote a op-ed for Real Clear Politics about this recently, we're essentially a superpower couple that has been married for 40 years. And during that 40 years, we had a lot of children. So the idea, I do think we should have a divorce, and I talk about why, because I think the majority of things we need to agree to disagree on, because they're obviously not coming our way on the things that we thought they were going to. But we're so entangled because of all these children that we have that are a part of the commercial exchange, the national security exchange, the different supply chain issues, everything else, that we have to have some semblance of a relationship in order to take care of all those children. So this whole idea of complete decoupling, I've been very vocal that I don't think it's realistic nor something that we should even try for. Number one is we're both superpowers. So the last thing we want to do is completely decouple from the other superpower that's a nuclear powerhouse. That's not good for the world or America. But the second thing is we spent 40 years trying to figure out how to monetize and utilize on a manufacturing level that country, and to take all that investment away and say no more puts us in a lurch. I mean, a lot of companies rely on that market for growth. So and then our supply chain issues are just as entangled. I mean,
they're extremely entangled. I end up having to talk about this all the time, so I know exactly what you're talking about. It's like it is a really difficult decoupling, as you've put it, and I really like that image of it. And there are ways at which we can gain some independence and gain some separation, but it's not going to ever be a complete separation without pain, a lot of pain.
Correct.
And on both sides, for that matter.
But one of the things, and we're 100% on the same page, one of the things that I want to do, though, is I think this public outcry as to what we've been doing with China to achieve what we've been achieving, A, is a lot of it's wrong, and B, what we've achieved has actually left 95% of America out of the equation in a lot of cases. So we need to work together as a country to come up with solutions. And I mean real solutions, not just sitting up on a soapbox and saying, LeBron, you need to speak against China about Hong Kong. Like that doesn't do anything.
Or you need to stop tweeting.
Right. You know? What we need to do is what I was talking about with engineering is, okay, here's the end goal, a reboot of the relationship that's good for America, but here's where we are. Like, how do we get to that solution? Well, we gotta work out all the carryover. So what are those different things? I've argued it's as simple as, how about the SEC apply the same accounting practices to Chinese companies that are hiding behind security issues because they're SOEs or state-owned enterprises, so that they don't have to have the same standards when they access our capital markets here in the US. That's ridiculous. Let's get rid of that. Okay, check that box. Oh, they're a developing country still? No, we were a developing country at one time too, and Europe gave us a lot of slack for that. But once we caught up, we got changed into a developed country. WTO changed China to a developed nation, put them on the same playing field as everybody else. Let's check that box.
So now you all are hearing like some of the things that it's playing, and this is why Chris is getting invited on these shows to talk to Steve Bannon and Anthony Scaramucci. There's you can see some of the commentary about this it's actually aligned across the aisle in two different places, right? And so how have you found that, Chris? How have you found the ability to be able to talk, on both sides of the US aisles, to be able to have that conversation to actually maybe make some shifts and make some things change, to check some of those boxes?
Yeah, well, number one is, well, first of all, a lot of this has been covered by the right way more than the left. So it's been a process trying to get on the NPRs and the Bloombergs. And I have something with MSNBC and CNN coming down the pike, which is good. But the right has been much more in tune to this problem. Now, one of the things that I think doesn't matter to me, even though it is something that people critique, is why is Senator Hawley, or why is Rep Gallagher, or why is Senator Marco Rubio, or why is Bill Barr screaming and yelling about China this, China that? Well, guess what? Some of them have elections coming up. Some have constituents that are mad. Some are trying to, pander to the president. Whatever it is, I don't really care. The good thing is it's being aired out. It's no longer a third rail issue. People are talking about it. And the more we talk about it, the more the public starts to understand what the problems are. Now,
and it's complex, which is also makes it more difficult to have a conversation about.
It's super complex because I get it. Marco Rubio calling out LeBron James and saying, speak up on behalf of the Hong Kong protesters. That's so easy for him because it gets him points with his constituents, and he has no personal sacrifice based on China. LeBron, on the other hand, and I get the whole political issue with them speaking out about various other things, but take that out of the equation. LeBron, yes, he wants to do the right thing. He wants to, speak up on behalf of Hong Kong and against what's going on with the Uyghurs and all that kind of stuff. But this personal sacrifice he makes to do that monetarily is massive. Now, you could say, oh, well, money is making him do this stuff. Okay, yeah, it is. But money is not an object with Marco Rubio. He has none of that to lose. And then the thing that's really difficult about it in general is that if LeBron does it, yeah, it might shut out the NBA and everybody from it. Or LeBron does it, he's out, and then Westbrook or somebody else comes in and does it and doesn't do it, is an ostrich in the sand, and they get all the money that LeBron gave up. So it becomes a whack-a-mole situation, and it doesn't change anything. Nothing.
So, Chris, do you have any advice before we go to our questions here? Do you have any advice for the next WeChat, the next TikTok, the next people who are building these ventures that are going on? And sort of like, are there things that we should have our eyes open about to make sure that we don't fall into a problem where we, because even look at Zoom, right? Zoom thought they were doing everything right. And then all of a sudden they were like, oh, your servers are over in China. You have a problem.
Well, I think the biggest change that's occurred, and it really happened the day Daryl Morey, the Houston Rockets GM, tweeted out his support on behalf of the Hong Kong protesters. The biggest change that's happened is this idea that you have to message both markets now on what you're doing to sell a product and service in China. So in the early days prior to Daryl Morey, which now seems like 50 years ago, you could pander, kowtow, do whatever the Chinese government was asking within the realm of making sure your product and service wasn't completely dampened by it, in order to get access to that market. And there was nobody really questioning here in the United States what exactly you were doing. Now, I think we need to keep two big things in mind. Number one is national security interests. And then number two is what makes us a healthy America, the principles and values and middle class that allows us to thrive as a nation. So those two things need to be thought of when we're trying to cater to the demands of the CCP and what they need in order to get our product and service in that country. And when we do that, we need to be transparent, because we are in China. We're bragging about, oh, we put this China thing in there, or, Nike has these new shoes that are selling really well over there, and they have the Beijing coordinates in the soles as a sort of a tribute to the Chinese government, right? We need to be vocal about it here and what we're doing and why we're okay with it. And it has to be messaged here saying, hey, look, this is putting Michelle Rodriguez into Fast and Furious because the Latino population, it has a huge car culture and it's a good piece of commerce and it adds to the diversity of the movie. Okay. That needs to be the same type of dynamic and message that we use every time we apply something strategically.
So is this meeting our values over here, and is it going to help it make more commerciable, which at the end of the day helps make more jobs here too? So we have to think about both at the same time.
Yep.
Great, Chris. Well, that's fabulous, and thank you so much for all of your sort of direct honesty about what's going on. I've got some more questions here in the chat here, and I'm gonna you touched on this briefly. So what is COVID? Serge has asked, what is COVID-19 outlook on the media and entertainment industry and the trends driven by the pandemic? So we've been hearing some things in the sort of local LA here about how we need our entertainment, our movies to be released around the world because they can't be released here. So we're in this sort of necessary, it's got to happen outside of the country. But what are you seeing as the COVID-19 outlook here?
Right. Well, a lot of COVID, the issues with the pandemic are just exacerbating trends that were happening to traditional businesses in general. And Hollywood is no different. So we were seeing a very fragile theatrical market, exhibition market here in the United States. People were clinging onto the habit, but we're still thinking, well, I got this huge TV at home. Maybe it's better just to keep the kids at home and have their friends over or whatever. So COVID has obviously moved that timeline of that habit dying off much faster. Okay. North America is different than other markets. So my guess, no one knows for sure where things are going, but my guess is, and a lot of people would agree, and there's going to be some disagreement on it, is that the habit of going to movie theaters here in the United States is going to wane massively once things open up. And we're going to move into this premium pay-per-view sort of first window, or maybe a hybrid window with theaters where there's some sort of collaboration.
So we were just having this debate this evening, or yesterday evening, because of Mulan. So Mulan is now, if for those of you who haven't heard, so Mulan was supposed to be released, I think it was last month, right? July. And now
originally in March.
Originally in March, yeah. And then again in July was the next date that they had set. And so now that they're going to release it on what, as a mother, I thought was a little bit overpriced, the release on a channel that you already subscribe to. And so it felt like a little nickel and diming. And so I think it will be an interesting thing to see how consumers respond here, especially moms, because we make a lot of those choices for our kids on those Disney type products.
I'm extremely interested on two fronts. One is, yes, does this new model work for movies in general, or tentpole $200 million movies? Is this a good model, and is this something that's going to get adapted? But the second reason I'm really interested in is whether the country, given the tenor and the rhetoric between the US and China right now, actually wants to watch all Chinese on a movie screen with all Chinese locations with Chinese mythology, even though it's a $200 million tentpole. Is that interesting to most of America? And then the second thing is, in China, where the rhetoric is just as bad towards the United States, here's a treasured piece of intellectual property or mythology that was made by one of the most iconic American companies on earth, right? Are they going to actually go see this movie? That's a big question.
It's going to be that litmus test. We'll find it really interesting. So Alex is asking where China stands today in the movie industry. Chinese own some of the major theaters in the US, produce many movies. Do you see any major shift already starting, or especially after the pandemic?
Well, obviously Wanda owned AMC and Carmike, the largest theater chain in the world, or in the United States. And then they sold off some of it through a public listing. They still own 40%. I would imagine if Wanda could, they want to just get completely rid of that thing, but it's obviously very depressed in value at the moment. But I don't see Chinese buying theaters anytime soon. The studio business, Wanda also owns Legendary. And then Tencent, Alibaba, Perfect World, those are companies that are also involved on the strictly passive investment front of various slates across Hollywood. If Hollywood has its way, they're going to want that money until the end of time. Whether China continues to finance it, because a lot of those deals haven't worked out on their behalf. So the combo of not being the best investments and the negative rhetoric between the two countries, and you look at Tencent, which has also been involved, and they have WeChat. you might see more running for the hills from the China side on the investment front.
Could be. Sonia's asking, tell us about ways in which Beijing's censors have affected and influenced Hollywood and the global filmmaking industry. So I think sort of understanding how the censors look at things.
Well, okay, so Ted Cruz has brought a lot of this to light with the Top Gun and the with the Bohemian Rhapsody ideas or movies as examples. Here's where I fall into it. There's two forms of censorship. One I'm okay with. That's how we cut a movie that's made to make it get through censorship in China, right? There's certain things they don't like. If there's undead or religious themes or crime happening in China or something derogatory that they think doesn't work for them, we cut it out, and then that edited cut is shown in China. And the reason why I'm okay with that is we do the same thing in Japan, the same thing in Korea. We do that in the Middle East with lots of movies. So
but it's not just about censorship, it's also about acceptability. So you probably wouldn't do as well as a movie within those countries if you didn't take some of that out.
Yeah, there's relevancies that you have to keep in mind as a business person with any product or service. So I'm okay with that. The censorship that they push, that they even were pushing as far back, and I talked about the Looper case study where we had to make sure Summer Chang, who was barely in the movie, was on the worldwide movie poster. There's a censorship cross-border that the CCP is involved with, which we have to shut down. And the reason for that is, or an example of that is the Taiwanese flag on Tom Cruise's jacket in Top Gun. They wanted removed from the movie. Fine, you don't want to show the Taiwanese flag in your country. That's okay. We're good with that. But no. They wanted it removed from the world cut of the movie so that nobody in Germany would see it or nobody in the United States. That is wrong to me for two reasons. One is China could say, well, we don't want our 1.4 billion people uprising because they believe Taiwanese freedom is something that, is something they can have or whatever it is. Well, guess what? You have a firewall system that can prevent them from ever seeing that movie. Okay, that version of the movie. So don't use that excuse. And by the way, it's not a good excuse either. So the second thing that's super offensive is they just want the message in that movie to be, there is no such thing as a separate entity of Taiwan. Taiwan is China. So you can't show that anywhere in the world because we want anyone in the world believing that Taiwan is a separate entity. Okay? That is wrong. And it's the same thing they did with Daryl Morey. That Daryl Morey tweet, which could be dangerous if it got into the China populace for the leadership to keep its position because it shows support for the uprising or whatever it is, it's firewalled. That tweet never got seen in China.
They never saw it, right?
But they're telling Daryl Morey while he's at his house in Houston, Texas, that he can't tweet that out to other Americans on our soil under our freedom of speech laws. That's completely unacceptable.
So that's that line that you see this, the differentiator is that we need to be us where we are. So.
Correct. And we can't change it. Going back to what we talked about, LeBron James can't change that by himself. He can be a sacrificial lamb all day long and lose everything. But we have to get behind it as industries together, as companies together, as leaders together, and as the country together. And maybe that's unicorns and rainbows, but I'd like to be optimistic.
You'd like to see it. Well, before we go, we've got one more question left. So Thomas Murphy's asking, how can the SEC work in tandem with the FTC to enact meaningful enforcement? So is there a governmental role? I think, tying into the last thing, is there some things we can do? And in the case we're talking about SEC, we're talking about that on that investment side of things. Are there things that we can do here that is going to make this easier to affect how things work, how the differences happen in the future?
The answer is yes, especially if it's bipartisan, right? Because then everybody gets behind it. If it's partisan politics, no, it won't work. But in the book, I talk about how the SEC was really trying to regulate Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations in China because they were so rampant, as they are in a lot of places. And if you get everybody playing by the same rules, then you don't have everybody undercutting and doing things that are technically illegal. So yes, there's a way for regulators to create rules for engagement that allow everybody the same kind of access and the same kind of abilities to be on a level competitive playing field.
Well, Chris, I'm so glad you were here. I want to do the last thing before we go, which is that you've got your book behind you. Could you grab it for us and bring it a little forward? So it's called Feeding the Dragon. Chris Fenton, when is it available, or is it available now?
It's available as of Tuesday, and we're
Tuesday.
already on our last Tuesday. So it's already out. We're already on our second printing, which is fantastic. And
That's
the reviews
fantastic.
have been really good. And I'm just enjoying it because I'm talking my book, but quite frankly, I've sacrificed a lot to be a squeaky wheel. So in a way, it's not like, oh, he's just out there trying to make money. I'm actually trying to get a message out there to all Americans that we need to address this. And I really appreciate everybody's time sitting through this. And I hope we're engaged.
Well,
and
we also have our Moonshot Museum. So what are you going to donate to our Moonshot Museum that we could auction off in the future or display and have people see? Will you come up with something for us and share that with the community?
I definitely will. I was thinking something like a combo of a signed book and maybe a Rolodex card or something like that. I don't know if it's going to get any money at an auction, but at least it's something.
Or
right?
maybe a poster.
You
do a signed poster. I think that would be a lot of fun. So eventually we'll have all of that in the Moonshot House Museum, and everyone will be able to peruse that. Of course, we'll probably have to do it virtual, but we'll make it happen, and then there'll be some kind of auction. And there are various charities being floated around as the beneficiaries. So we'll be talking about that in future. Just before we go, thank you so much, Chris Fenton. But just before we go, I want to remind everybody that we have Michael Gorton, and we're going to be talking about Back to Space in September, and that's Friday, September 4th at 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Pacific time.
Yeah,
Michael Gorton, of course, founding. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm on Twitter at the Dragon Feeder. I'm new on it, but I've acquired a lot of followers pretty quick, and I'm having a lot of fun on there debating different things. So please feel free to follow if you want to engage anymore.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Chris. We really appreciate you.
Tracy, Chris, this was a great conversation. We don't have time, Chris, for you to answer this, but one thing that's on everyone's minds this morning is, of course, the 2 executive orders issued by the White House targeting ByteDance, parent company of arguably the most popular app at the moment, TikTok, and probably more impactfully, Tencent, which you've talked about, which is the parent company of WeChat, but also owns a major stake in some of the largest entertainment properties, gaming companies, its content IP holders on Earth, and that might be something interesting. Just a quick hot take before we go. I know that the news commentators are going to be all over this. But quick thoughts on that. Obviously, too soon to tell. But what's your quick reaction?
Look, I mean, we're moving into election season, and I think China is a big side. It's a big issue for the right, and particularly President Trump to engage on and possibly use as deflection from other things. So I think we're going to see a lot of that. And then on top of it, the populace, the constituents of this country, both red and blue, are waking up to a lot of things that they dislike about China. So this is going to be a nice red meat issue for both sides of the aisle, quite frankly. So I think we're going to see a lot more of it.
And a lot of companies uneasy, given that WeChat is the most used messaging app in the world and is fundamental to the interconnections between teams working back and forth across the Pacific for some of our largest companies. So this is not an idle thing. Imagine waking up in the morning and being told Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Slack are no longer able to be used by American companies, how that would affect industry. Chris, always looking forward to hearing more from you. Tracy, wonderful job on this interview. You're a delight to our community. And along with the Michael Gorton interview, which you'll be doing on September 4th, I'm really looking forward to that, by the way. Michael Gorton's founding CEO of Teladoc, really helping to create what is now a $250 billion telemedicine industry. And we'll learn more about his new venture, Back to Space.
With some significant threats. There's some great stories there.
Absolutely. And your personal relationship with him, I think, is going to make that a very interesting conversation. Just want to remind folks as we close here that we also have another Moonshotters Roundtable, a different format, coming up on Thursday, August 20. And then we have our social hour, which is using a virtual platform that allows you to move around different rooms and engage in private and small group conversations. That's coming up on Thursday, August 27. So a lot coming from us here at the Moonshot House community. On behalf of everybody who attended, everyone who's watching this inside our private app on a replay, everyone who is part of our community, thanks so much for your participation. We wouldn't be Moonshot House without you. Till next time, we're signing off.
Thanks, everyone.